Hello, my dear friend. Let everything slow. The Old Hunters is the story of what the healing church buried. Not the old blood. Everyone knows about the old blood. Not the blood ministration and the beast scourge. That story is told in the streets of Yharnam itself, visible in every locked door and barricaded window and burning corpse. The buried story is older and more specific, and more deliberately hidden than the main game's horror. It is the story of what the first hunters did. Before the healing church had built its grand institutions, before blood ministration had spread to every corner of Yharnam, before any of the factions the main game involves had fully formed, a group of hunters went to a fishing village and did something that the dead god they found there refused to forgive. The hunter's nightmare is the consequence, the specific place of punishment that was created in response to a specific crime. To understand the nightmare, to understand why it exists, what it contains, who is trapped in it, and why, you have to understand the sin that produced it. Tonight we start at the beginning, before the nightmare, before the fishing Hamlet, before Lady Maria and Ludwig and Laurence and Simon. We start with a body on a beach. What Kos was, Kos, a great one. One of the specific entities whose nature and existence the main game circles around without fully revealing. The Great Ones are not gods in the conventional sense, not beings who desire worship or require devotion. They are something older and stranger. Cosmic intelligences whose specific relationship to humanity is organized around a desire they cannot fulfill themselves. They seek communion. They seek, in their specific and incomprehensible way, children. Beings that share something of their nature, that might bridge the distance between human consciousness and whatever the Great Ones are. The tragedy of the Great Ones, the specific grief that runs beneath every piece of law involving them, is that their children are always stillborn. The offspring of a Great One born into the world does not survive. The specific gap between cosmic intelligence and human flesh produces beings that cannot sustain themselves in the material world, that are born already dying. Kos was a Great One of a specific kind. Not the moon presence, which operates through dreams and the hunter's dream. Not Ebrietas, whom the healing church encountered in the labyrinths and brought into the world. Kos was associated with the sea, with the specific vastness of the ocean and what lives at its depths. With the parasites that passed through the village, she washed up near and transformed the people who lived there. She was dead when she arrived. The body of a Great One, enormous and strange, carried by the current to the coast near a small fishing village and deposited there. The villagers found her. They recognized something divine in what they had found. Recognized in the specific way of people who have lived close to the sea and who understand the specific mystery of things that come from depths they cannot reach, that this was not simply a large dead animal. They began to worship her. They tended to her body. They took the parasites that poured from her remains, parasites that had lived inside a Great One and carried something of that nature within them, and incorporated them into their lives. The parasites were significant. Contact with them, for beings without the specific capacity to handle such things, produced madness. For the villagers who had lived with Kos, who had been in proximity to her body and her parasites for long enough, it produced transformation. The fishing Hamlet's inhabitants became something between human and something else. Amphibious, strange. Their physiology altered by years of contact with the remnants of a dead god. They were not suffering from this transformation. They were changed, yes, but they retained something that other victims of transformation in Bloodborne's world often lost, their devotion. Their prayers continued. They tended what remained of Kos, with the specific care of people who understood what they had been given access to. They did not know that Bürgenwerth had become aware of them. The scholars and the sea, Bürgenwerth College, the institution that predated the Healing Church, whose scholars had been studying the Pthumerians and their knowledge of the Great Ones, who split between Master Willem and Laurence, would produce everything that the main game depicts, had a specific theory about the Great Ones. They believed the Great Ones were connected to the sea, not as an abstract metaphor, as a literal relationship. The specific depths of the ocean, the specific quality of the water that covered most of the world's surface, was where the scholars believed the Great Ones had their most direct point of contact with the material world. The fishing hamlet had attracted attention through some combination of the villagers' transformation and the reports of Kos's body on the coast. Bürgenwerth sent hunters. Among those hunters, Gehrman, Lady Maria, and according to some readings of the fragmentary lore, perhaps Laurence himself, the man who had split from Willem and found the Healing Church, who would initiate the blood ministration that would eventually destroy Yharnam. They came to the fishing hamlet to harvest, not to worship or to study in the patient way that respects what is being studied, to take. The eyes, specifically. The choir's practices, the procedures visible in the research hall that the DLC eventually takes the hunter through, required eyes. Eyes with a specific currency of insight in Bloodborne's world, the literal organ through which contact with the Great Ones produced the ability to perceive more of the cosmic truth. What happened in the fishing hamlet is presented in fragments. The lore does not offer a continuous account. What it assembles from item descriptions and NPC dialogue and environmental storytelling, the hunters took the village's inhabitants, took their eyes, used the parasites in experiments that would eventually lay the foundation for what the choir did in the research hall. And at some point, they violated Kos's body, harvested from the dead Great One herself, took whatever could be taken from the remnants of something divine. The villagers who had been worshipping Kos, who had been transformed by proximity to her body, who had been tending her remains, were killed or subjected to experiments that were not designed with their survival as a priority. Their prayers to Kos continued even as this happened. And Kos, dead, physically dead, her body on the beach, was not entirely absent. The Great Ones do not die in the simple way that humans die. Their minds persist in the cosmic plane, and the minds of the dead can hear the prayers of the living. Kos heard. The curse. A Great One's curse is not a simple thing. It is not a punishment in the conventional sense of a power deliberately directed at the ones who offended it. It is the specific cosmic weight of a dead god's grief, shaped by the prayers of the people who suffered, taking the form that the suffering itself implied. The hunters had come to the fishing hamlet blood-drunk, not simply following orders, consumed by the hunt, by the specific quality of hunters who have lost the capacity to see the beings they are hunting as anything other than prey. The hunt had been the mechanism for doing what was done at the fishing hamlet, and the hunt was what the curse took. The hunter's nightmare, a separate layer of reality. Not quite the material world, not quite the dream, where hunters who have gone blood-drunk are condemned to an unending hunt. The same repetitive violence, without rest, without resolution, without the specific ending that death would provide. Not as simple as going to hell, as something more precise, being given forever of what they had chosen. The hunt never ending, the prey never exhausted. The blood-drunk state that had enabled the atrocity at the fishing hamlet maintained as the permanent condition of those it had claimed. Every hunter who had participated, and every hunter who subsequently became blood drunk, since the curse was not limited to the specific participants, but extended to the specific condition they had embodied, was drawn into the nightmare. They continued hunting, in a landscape of constant violence, forever. Ludwig was among them, the holy blade who had been revered as the greatest of the Healing Church's hunters, whose specific legacy had inspired generations of church hunters who had followed his example, was in the nightmare. What the nightmare had done to him over the long period of his imprisonment, transformative in the specific direction of beast, the transformation he had been fighting against his entire career as a hunter, expressing itself fully in the absence of any reason to hold it back. Gehrman was not in the nightmare. The specific reason for this is one of the law's most discussed ambiguities. Whether he was not blood drunk at the time of the fishing Hamlet events, or whether the Moon Presence's contract had provided him a different kind of imprisonment, or whether he had not been present at all. The law allows multiple readings. Lady Maria was in the nightmare, the most faithful hunter that Gehrman had ever trained. The woman in whose image the plain doll had been created was in the hunter's nightmare, imprisoned there as one of the hunters who had been at the fishing Hamlet. She was not mindlessly hunting. She had retained her sanity, and with her sanity, she had retained something else. The specific weight of what she had participated in, carried without relief, in the place where what she had done kept her permanently. Sleep well. 7 more parts remain, and the nightmare has been waiting a long time. The hunter's nightmare is organized around a specific kind of geography, not simply a place, a layered history. The 3 major areas of the DLC move backwards through time, each one revealing an earlier layer of the Healing Church's sin. The hunter's nightmare itself, where the bulk of the DLC's opening takes place, represents the most recent layer. The hunters of the established Healing Church era, the ones who came after Ludwig. Ludwig is at the center of the nightmare's first area in the specific way that a founding figure tends to occupy the center of the institution he built. The greatest hunter the Healing Church ever produced. The man whose specific approach to fighting beasts, disciplined, methodical, organized around the principle that hunters could work together, rather than simply being a collection of extraordinary individuals, had transformed what hunting meant in Yharnam. Before Ludwig, hunters were singular. The workshop tradition that Gehrman had established produced exceptional individuals who fought alone or in small groups. After Ludwig, the church hunters, an organized force. Rank and hierarchy and the specific institutional logic that allowed the Healing Church to project hunting capability across a wider area than individual hunters could cover. He had been revered. His name was invoked as an example. His holy blade, the weapon system he had developed, the paired pistol and sword that had become the standard starting equipment for church hunters, was named for him. Hunters who followed his tradition were called Ludwigian. In the nightmare, he was a beast, enormous, quadrupedal, his hunter's body long since consumed by the transformation that blood ministration eventually produced in the insufficiently fortified, his mind barely present, the specific horror of a being who had spent his career fighting beasthood and had been defeated by it, not in a single moment, but over the long duration of the nightmare's endless hunt. What Ludwig was before. The lore that surrounds Ludwig draws a specific portrait through the items associated with him. The Holy Moonlight Sword, the great weapon that he found in the nightmare, the sword that seems to contain captured moonlight in its blade, suggests contact with something beyond what ordinary hunters encountered. the specific note attached to it, he discovered something in the nightmare. Something that kept him together longer than the endless hunt should have. He had been, before the nightmare, genuinely holy. Not in the performative sense of the healing church's later theological elaborations, in the specific sense of someone whose dedication to protecting people had been his primary motivation. The hunters who followed him, who wore the hunter uniforms associated with his tradition, who carried the flame sprayer and the saw spear and the standard starting equipment. They had been responding to his specific vision of what hunting was for. For Ludwig, hunting was a vocation, a calling, the specific response to a world where the blood scourge was consuming people who deserved protection, where the beasts were real and the violence against them was genuinely necessary rather than simply permitted. He had not simply accepted the killing as what hunting required. He had organized the killing around the principle that the killing was in service of something. This is why his deterioration in the nightmare was so specifically devastating. Not simply that a powerful warrior became a beast, but that the person who had built the philosophy of the hunt around service had been ground down by endless hunting without purpose until the philosophy had nothing left to sustain it. The blood moon and the nightmare. The hunter who enters the nightmare. The player character who receives an eye of a blood-drunk hunter from a wheelchair figure at the beginning of the DLC and finds themselves deposited in a nightmare landscape, arrives at a specific moment in the nightmare's geography. The landscape is Yharnam, but wrong. The specific quality of a nightmare that uses the material of the dreamer's memory, the streets and the architecture and the general visual language of Yharnam, but rearranged, extended into configurations that the material city did not have, populated by hunters who should be dead, and environments that serve the nightmare's specific logic rather than any geographic reality. The blood-drunk hunters, former church hunters, former healing church operatives, drawn into the nightmare by the condition the curse required. Some of them carry items that identify specific histories, the specific weapons and armor of hunters who appear in the main game's world, whose fates in the nightmare illuminate what happened to them after the main game's events or in the period before it. Jorah's disciple is here, the old hunter who had guarded old Yharnam, who had famously turned against the hunt after watching what the burning of old Yharnam had done, who had vowed to protect the beasts rather than hunt them. His disciple is in the nightmare, still carrying the oath of protection for the beasts that huddle behind him. Still faithful, still trying to maintain the specific vow in an environment that is organized entirely around the negation of it. The geography moves through the nightmare's version of Yharnam streets, past the hunters who attack without recognition, through environments that have the specific quality of familiar things in wrong configurations. The logic of a nightmare, where the material is correct and the arrangement is not. And at the bottom, encountered at the end of the nightmare's initial area, Ludwig. The fight and what it means. The encounter with Ludwig the Accursed is one of the DLC's most deliberately structured encounters. Not simply a boss fight, a document of what the nightmare has done to him. He attacks as an enormous beast, not recognizably human, not recognizably the holy blade of the healing church's hagiographic tradition. Something that fights with the specific ferocity of a creature that has been hunting for longer than it can process, that has no remaining capacity for the consideration of who or what it is hunting. And then, at some point in the encounter, something shifts. The holy moonlight sword illuminates. Ludwig, in the presence of the weapon he had found in the nightmare, the weapon that had been for him, the specific object that had preserved some connection to who he had been. Remembers, not everything, not the full account of his life and his vocation and his dedication, but something, the specific fragment of identity that the weapon had been sustaining through everything the nightmare had ground down. He fights differently in this second phase, not as simply a beast, as a hunter beast, using the weapon with something approaching the skilled motion of the hunter he had been, fighting in a way that carries the echo of Ludwig's actual combat style, rather than simply the undifferentiated violence of beasthood. When he is defeated, he does not die immediately. The specific quality of the encounter's aftermath, what Ludwig says in the moments after the fight, is one of Bloodborne's most carefully constructed pieces of character work. He asks whether the hunter is of the church, whether they have come as a Ludwigian hunter. If the hunter is carrying a specific church item, one of the older church hats, worn during the encounter, he perceives them as a successor, as someone who is continuing what he built. And what he says in that moment is significant. He saw a vision of the hunters following after him, and in the dream they looked the same as him. He had believed that the hunters he inspired were genuinely following his example, that the vision was a confirmation of legacy. The interpretation of this moment is one of the law's most debated questions. Whether the vision was a comfort or a horror, whether seeing hunters who looked like him was hope, or the specific nightmarish recognition that the institution he had built had produced more of what the nightmare contained. The game allows both readings without resolving them. He was not, in the end, saved by the fight. Defeating him did not undo the nightmare's effects or restore what the hunt had consumed. It resolved the specific situation. The hunter could proceed, while leaving whatever Ludwig had been before the nightmare somewhere behind the beast he became. Simon the Harrowed. At the first shortcut back to the nightmare's lamp, a hunter is waiting. Not a blood-drunk hunter from the nightmare's trapped population. Someone who entered deliberately, who maintained his sanity through whatever mechanism he used to preserve it, who had a specific reason for being in a place that others arrived in as a form of punishment. Simon, the Harrowed, a church hunter who had been, before his time in the nightmare, an ordinary member of the institution, someone who had followed Ludwig's tradition and believed in the Healing Church's mission and served as a hunter in the way that church hunters served. He had seen things change, the specific arc of the Healing Church's history, from the early period of Ludwig's founding vision, where hunting was in service of protecting people from the blood scourge, to the later period where the institution's research had moved into territory that the founding vision could not have sanctioned, had produced in Simon a crisis that he had not been able to resolve internally. He was searching for the original sin. His specific phrase, used in dialogue with the hunter, carries the specific theological weight of someone who had grown up inside an institution and discovered that the institution's origin was not what the institution claimed. He was in the nightmare because the nightmare was where the evidence was, where the secrets that the Healing Church had been keeping were present in a form that could not be hidden, the way they were hidden in the material world. He would guide the hunter through the DLC's progression, appearing at specific locations, providing context that the environment alone could not fully supply. Not because he was simply a helpful NPC, because his specific goal and the hunter's specific goal pointed in the same direction, toward the same destination, for reasons that would become clearer as both of them moved deeper into what the nightmare was hiding. He was also being hunted. Bradel, the church's beast-clad assassin, The specific figure whose role was to ensure that the healing church's secrets did not leave the nightmare through the specific mechanism of killing anyone who got too close to them, was tracking him, had been attacking him repeatedly across the duration of his time in the nightmare. Simon was wounded. He was tired. He had been searching for longer than the search had been designed to accommodate, and what he was searching for was at the very end of the nightmare, in the place that the nightmare had been organized to protect, the fishing hamlet. Sleep well. 6 more parts remain, and the astral clock tower is ahead. Beyond Ludwig's arena, the nightmare continues upward. The architecture changes from the street-level horror of the hunter-populated nightmare city to something more institutional, more deliberate. The specific visual language of a building that was built for a purpose, that organized its spaces around the function of research rather than the function of living. The research hall. The second of the DLC's 3 major areas, and the one that corresponds to the healing church's intermediate period. The era after Ludwig's founding vision had given the institution its structure, but before the earliest sin at the fishing hamlet. The era when the choir had been developing its specific methods, when the specific experiments that would become the healing church's most deeply buried secret were being conducted in a place that the institution's public face did not acknowledge. Tonight we follow what the research hall contains, and what it means for the hunter and for Laurence, the man whose skull sits at the center of everything. The patients, they fill the hall. The specific figures that inhabit the research hall's corridors and treatment areas, the patients of whatever the choir was doing here, are immediately distinct from the beasts and blood-drunk hunters that populate the rest of the nightmare. They are almost human. Their forms suggest what they were before. People who came to the healing church for the specific promise that blood ministration offered. Healing, strength, perhaps transcendence. The healing church's public offering was not false. Blood did heal. The old blood carried genuine medicinal power alongside its capacity for corruption. People came because the healing was real. What the choir offered in the research hall was something different from standard blood ministration, something that promised more than healing, insight, the specific quality of perception that the main game associates with madness, and with the ability to see what ordinary eyes cannot perceive. Eyes. The choir was giving patients eyes, not metaphorically, literally modifying their physiology through the specific methods that contact with Great One knowledge had suggested, attempting to produce in ordinary people the specific sensory organ that would allow them to perceive more of the cosmic truth. The surgery scarps on the inside of skulls, the specific procedures visible in the research hall's altar, and the associated item descriptions. The accursed brew, a bloodstone formed inside a human body that had been subjected to these procedures. The specific product of a body that had been given more than it could process, that had attempted to incorporate what the choir had inserted and produce something monstrous in the attempt. The patients had not all survived the process as people. Most of them were transformed. The specific transformation of someone who had been given insight they could not accommodate, whose mind had fractured under the weight of perceiving things that human consciousness was not designed to perceive, whose body had been altered by procedures performed on the assumption that the alteration was possible without fully accounting for whether the person who experienced it would remain a person afterward. Lady Maria cared for them. In the nightmare, the patients in the research hall were her specific responsibility. She moved through the hall and the attached areas with the specific quality of someone who was paying a debt, not performing kindness for its own sake, though the patients responded to her as though she was something saintly, performing the specific care that the guilt of having participated in what produced them demanded. Whether she had directly participated in the research hall's experiments is not confirmed. Whether her presence in the nightmare was the consequence of the fishing Hamlet alone, or of a broader range of what the old hunters had done, the law allows both. What is confirmed, she had been there. She was in the nightmare. And she had chosen to spend the nightmare's duration in the research hall's corridors rather than in the endless hunt. Adeline. Among the research hall's patients, one retained enough coherence to communicate. Adeline, the patient who crouches in one of the hall's upper areas, who will ask the hunter for blood, specifically for the brain fluid that the procedures had left accumulating in the bodies of the less fortunate patients. She is performing a ritual of her own kind, using the brain fluid, the specific product of the choir's experiments, accumulated in patients whose minds had fractured under the weight of what was being done to them, to advance her own transformation in the direction of insight, not simply accepting what was done to her, using it. Adeline has retained the specific quality of will that the hall's other patients have mostly lost. She knows approximately what she is doing. She knows approximately what she is working toward. The specific understanding of a person who has been subjected to something terrible and has decided to find in the something terrible a path toward what she actually wants. What she wants, to be a blood saint, the choir's highest achievers, the specific practitioners who had gone furthest along the path of insight that the research hall was built to produce, to draw power directly from the Great One Odin, the formless Odin, who exists as sound and blood and who requires no corporeal form, to become what the research hall was trying to produce, a human vessel capable of channeling Great One power. She achieves this at the end of her quest line, in a form that is not exactly what anyone would have hoped for. The specific image of Adeline's transformation, what she becomes when the insight has been fully incorporated, is one of the DLC's most memorable environmental moments. Not horror in the conventional sense, something stranger. She leaves the hunter a gesture, the make contact gesture, the specific movement that appears in Bloodborne's lore as a way of communicating with great ones, as the gesture of reaching towards something cosmic. She had learned it, she had found, through the research hall's procedures and the brain fluid she consumed, and the specific path she had chosen through all of it. Something like what the choir had been reaching for. Whether this is presented as success or horror depends on what you believe about the nature of what she has become. Laurence's skull. In the research hall's inner areas, the hunter finds an item that the main game had not fully explained. Laurence's skull. The skull of the first vicar, the man who had split from Willem, founded the healing church, initiated the blood ministration that had eventually consumed Yharnam. A skull, kept in a specific location, described as what Laurence failed to protect. He sought it because it served as a reminder of what he failed to protect, the creed of Bergenwerth and his own humanity. This item description is one of the law's most compressed revelations. Laurence, who built the healing church, who organized the institution around which Yharnam's entire society had structured itself, who was revered as the first vicar, whose name was invoked with reverence throughout the healing church's tradition, had a skull that he kept as a reminder of his own moral failure. What had he failed to protect? Not the healing church's mission in general, not the people of Yharnam, who had been consuming the old blood under his institution's guidance and were being consumed by it, the creed of Bergenwerth, the specific intellectual and ethical principles that Master Willem had built the institution around, the principles that Laurence had left behind when he chose to pursue the blood, rather than the wisdom Willem's approach represented, and his own humanity, the specific personal quality of a man who had made a choice that required abandoning something he recognized in the retrospective clarity of the nightmare as something he should not have abandoned. In the nightmare, Laurence was a beast, not simply blood-drunk in the way of the hunters, fully beastified, a cleric beast whose specific form showed what the Healing Church's founding had eventually produced in the man who had founded it. He fought with the ferocity of something that had been a very powerful person and retained that power in a form that had lost the purpose the power had served. His skull, found in the nightmare's version of the Grand Cathedral, was what he had abandoned when he built the institution that did what it did, not a relic of his greatness, a memorial to his failure. The astral clock tower, above the research hall, accessible through the area's upper sections, the astral clock tower, a structure of specific visual distinction, a clock tower with astronomical elements, suggesting the specific relationship to the stars and the cosmos that runs through Bloodborne's most elevated locations. Lady Maria is here, sitting in a chair, blood pooling from wounds at her wrists and neck, the specific image of a person who has chosen to remain in a specific state of dying in the specific way of beings in Bloodborne, who persist in conditions that should not be sustainable. She is here because this is where the entrance to the fishing hamlet is hidden. The clock tower opens a path that the nightmare's geography does not otherwise make accessible. The specific route to the thing that the nightmare exists to protect, or the thing whose protection the nightmare serves as from certain angles. A corpse should be left well alone. Her first words to the hunter are not simply a warning about disturbing her. They are, in the specific way that Bloodborne's most resonant lines work, a statement with multiple reference. She may be referring to herself. She is, in some sense, a corpse, preserved in the nightmare in a state that should have ended. She may be referring to Kos, whose body was violated, whose corpse was the site of the crime that produced the nightmare. She may be referring to the secret the clock tower guards, what the fishing hamlet contains, which the hunter is about to find. The fight with Lady Maria that follows is one of Bloodborne's most celebrated encounters, not for its difficulty specifically, though it is demanding, for its emotional weight and its visual design, and the specific quality of a fight against someone whose history the player now understands sufficiently to find the battle genuinely tragic, rather than simply challenging. Sleep well. 5 more parts remain, and the clock tower is about to open. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. The encounter that the DLC had been building toward since the moment the hunter entered the nightmare. Not the final boss, not the deepest sin, but the guardian of the path to both. The specific person who had chosen to remain in a nightmare rather than leave the secret unguarded. Tonight we follow Maria specifically, her history before the nightmare, what she was, what she did, what she chose to do with what she had done. Who Maria was, she came from Cainhurst, the castle of the Vileblood clan, the bloodline that the Healing Church had declared heretical, whose specific relationship to blood and to Annalise the Undying Queen had put them in direct opposition to the Church's theological framework. Cainhurst was a place of aristocratic excess, its specific aesthetic of grandeur and blood, and the kind of beauty that carries something decadent in it. Maria was of Cainhurst lineage. She wore the armor of that lineage. the highest blood defense rating of any set in the game. Practical in the specific way that armor made for people who fight other beings that use blood as a weapon tends to be practical. She carried the rakuyo, a trick weapon of Canehurst craft, a slim and elegant blade that deployed a secondary blade in combat, requiring skill rather than strength to use effectively. This is the specific detail that the law emphasizes about Maria in a setting organized around blood. She favored skill over blood. Her weapon did not rely on blood damage or blood consumption. Her specific approach to fighting was built on dexterity and precision, rather than the blood-enhanced power that most Bloodborne weapons draw from. In a world where the entire metaphysics of power was organized around blood, she had chosen an approach that deliberately minimized that relationship. She had come to Gehrman, the old workshop, the institution that predated the healing church, whose founding figure had developed the hunter's tools and the hunter's dream, had been where she trained. She had been, according to the law, his most faithful student. The specific relationship between them, Gehrman and Maria, had a quality that the doll illuminates in the most indirect possible way. The plain doll, the passive figure in the hunter's dream, who levels the hunter and who speaks with a kindness that feels genuine rather than performed, was created by Gehrman in Maria's image. When Maria disappeared, after the fishing Hamlet, the man who had trained her and who had developed something more than a teacher's regard for his student, created a doll in her likeness and prayed to a great one to bring her back. The prayer was answered, not in the way Gehrman had hoped. The doll was not Maria, did not have Maria's specific consciousness, was not the restoration he had been attempting, but she existed, and she shared Maria's face and Maria's voice and something of the specific quality that Maria had had, filtered through whatever the Great One's specific understanding of that quality was. Gehrman had built a memorial without intending to build one. The doll was his grief made physical, the fishing Hamlet and what followed. Maria had been among the hunters sent to the fishing Hamlet. She had participated in what happened there. The specific nature of her participation, what exactly she did among the things that were done to the village and to Kos's body, is not detailed. The law establishes her presence. What she actually did, in the specific action sense, is left to inference. What it produced in her, something she could not continue carrying as though it were simply a thing that had happened. The hunt had always been the mechanism for difficult things. Hunters killed because killing was necessary, because the alternative was allowing the blood scourge to consume people who deserved protection. The specific moral economy of hunting was built on necessity. The fishing Hamlet was not necessity in the same way. The villagers had not been a threat. The experiments on them had not been in defense of Yharnam's population. The violation of Kos's body had not been required for anything that the people involved could justify to the Maria who had chosen the rakuyo because she preferred skill to blood. At some point after the fishing Hamlet, she forfeited her weapon. The rakuyo, her beloved blade, the weapon she had chosen over blood-reliant alternatives, the specific instrument of a hunter's philosophy. She threw down a well because she could no longer stomach it. This is the specific phrase the law preserves. She could no longer stomach it. Not that the weapon was tainted or contaminated. that she herself could no longer bear to hold the thing that represented what she was, because what she was had become someone who had done what was done at the fishing hamlet. She disappeared into the nightmare, not consumed by the hunt in the way that the blood-drunk hunters were consumed. She went. She took herself there, or was drawn there because of the specific state the fishing hamlet's sin had produced in her. Whether she went voluntarily or was drawn by the curse is one of the law's unresolved questions. What the outcome was is not. She was in the nightmare, at the clock tower, guarding the path to the fishing hamlet, with the specific quality of a person who had chosen to remain at the site of her guilt rather than leave. I admired the doll and the grave that the doll is seen praying at in the main game, the specific grave that connects to the hunter's nightmare when the eye of a blood-drunk hunter is used, is Maria's grave. The plain doll, in her image, prays at the grave of the woman whose image she carries. This is one of the main game's most beautiful and most sad environmental details. The doll, who was created to be a substitute for Maria, who is the inadequate replacement for the specific person Gehrman lost, prays at that person's grave, not knowing, or knowing in whatever way the doll knows things, that the woman she resembles is not simply dead, but is present in the nightmare that the grave accesses. She is the connection between the hunter's dream and the hunter's nightmare. Maria's grave is the threshold between the two places, between the prison that the moon presence built for Gehrman and the prison that Kos's curse built for the hunters. Two nightmares, touching at a specific point, marked by a grave and tended by a doll. The fight itself. When the hunter reaches the clock tower and approaches the chair where Maria waits, blood pooling from her wrists and neck, her eyes closed, a figure preserved in the specific state of dying without being allowed to finish dying. She speaks, then fights. The fight has 3 phases that track with the DLC's broader design. She uses the Rakuyo through the first phase. The weapons she had forfeited in the material world present here because the nightmare has its own logic about what exists within it. She is a skilled opponent, fast and precise in the way of someone trained by Gehrman, using the weapon with the fluency of decades. The second phase, she drives her blades into herself, unlocking blood attacks. The blood that she had always tried to distance herself from, that she had chosen the Rakuyo specifically to avoid relying on, emerges here because the nightmare's logic strips the choice away. She bleeds, and she uses the bleeding as a weapon, and the specific irony of this is not subtle. The third phase, fire is added to the blood. Her attacks gain the specific combination of blood and flame that the research hall and the healing church's larger project had always been working toward. 3 phases, denial, blood, and fire. The progression of what the healing church's history had done, expressed through the body of one of its most faithful hunters. She dies with the specific grace of the fight's opening, reaching upward toward the sky before collapsing, the same gesture as Gehrman dying. Make contact, reaching towards something she could not reach. What she drops, the celestial dial and access to the fishing hamlet's entrance, the path to where the nightmare began. What the clock tower opened. The fishing hamlet is above and beyond the astral clock tower's mechanism. The clock's hands wind to a specific rune, the Great Lake rune, associated with water as a protection of sleep, and an augur of eldritch truth, and the path opens. The Hamlet in the nightmare is not the Hamlet as it was when Kos's body arrived on the beach. It is the Hamlet as the nightmare preserved it. The village in the specific moment of the sin, transformed by decades in the nightmare, in which inhabitants still present in the transformed state that their long proximity to Kos had produced. They remember the specific quality of the fishing hamlet's enemies, the way they mutter and gesture, the specific hostility that is different from the simple aggression of the main game's beasts, is the hostility of memory, of people who know what happened to them and to the person they had venerated, who have been in the nightmare as long as the hunters have been in the nightmare, who have had the same amount of time to sit with what was done. Simon is here, lying at the lighthouse hut lamp, wounded by Brador's repeated attacks, having reached the end of his search. He can no longer continue. He gives the hunter what he has, the key that accesses Brador's cell, Simon's bow blade, and the information that the end of the nightmare is ahead. He dies. His search is complete in the specific way that searches are complete when the searcher reaches the destination and can go no further. Not accomplished, but arrived. He found what he was looking for. He did not live to do anything with the finding. Sleep well. 4 more parts remain, and the orphan is waiting on the beach. The fishing hamlet in the nightmare, the endpoint of everything the DLC has been building toward, the specific location that Lady Maria guarded, that the nightmare was organized to protect or to preserve or to keep hidden, the place where the sin that produced the hunter's nightmare was committed. It exists in the nightmare in a specific relationship to its material world counterpart. The fishing hamlet that existed in the real world, on the coast where Kos's body had washed ashore, is not simply replicated in the nightmare. It is preserved in the nightmare with a particular quality of time. The hamlet has been in the nightmare for as long as the nightmare has existed. Its inhabitants have been transforming in proximity to Kos's persistent presence for the entire duration. And tonight we follow the hamlet's geography and what it reveals. The inhabitants, Brador, the lighthouse, and the beach where everything began and where everything ends. The village that was taken. The approach to the fishing hamlet in the nightmare communicates its specific history through the landscape before a single NPC is encountered. The ship masts above the village, enormous, out of proportion to anything a fishing village should have, floating at the level that corresponds to the roof of the Nightmare of Menses, visible from far below. The barnacles and coral growing across the walls and floors of the buildings, the sea having reclaimed the village in ways that only make sense if the village has been underwater, or adjacent to underwater, for a very long time. The inhabitants that populate the hamlet are not simply monsters. They are, beneath the transformation, recognizable as people, as the fishermen and villagers who had been here when Bergenwerth's hunters arrived. The specific transformation that proximity to Kos and her parasites had been producing in them continued across the duration of their time in the nightmare, had moved them further along a path that had been beginning when the hunters found them. They are amphibious, partially aquatic. Their physiology has adapted to the proximity of the sea and of Kos's lingering presence in the nightmare. They walk upright, but their movement has the specific quality of creatures that are equally comfortable in water. They carry their village's tools, the implements of a fishing community, and use them as weapons with the specific desperation of people who are defending something. They mutter. The specific quality of the fishing hamlet's inhabitants that distinguishes them from other enemies in Bloodborne is this: they speak, in fragments, in repetitions, in the specific broken cadences of speech that has been sustained in a nightmare for long enough to lose some of its coherence while retaining its emotional content. They speak of Kos. They speak of what was done to them. They speak of the curse. A hunter will be cursed and rot on the battlefield. This is not a generic enemy line. It is the specific curse that is still active, still being spoken by the people who were subjects of the sin that created the nightmare. They are not simply attacking the hunter because the hunter is present. They are expressing the specific ongoing hostility of people whose prayers produced the nightmare and who are, in some sense, are still praying. Breda, the church assassin. The beast-clothed figure who had been hunting Simon through the DLC, whose repeated attacks had left him wounded and exhausted, who had been tracking the hunter from the moment the hunter moved too deep into the nightmare's secrets. Breda is one of the Healing Church's most specifically disturbing figures, not because of his capability in combat, though he is a formidable opponent, because of what he is and what he represents. He is a church operative whose specific function is the maintenance of secrets, not simply killing enemies, killing the church's own associates when those associates get too close to what the church needs to remain secret. Simon was investigating the original sin. The hunter was investigating the original sin. Breda's job was to ensure the investigation ended before it reached its destination. He wears a beast's hide, the specific clothing of someone who has incorporated beasthood into their identity rather than fighting it, who has made the transformation that hunters are supposed to prevent into the instrument of their purpose. He is what the Healing Church looked like when it was willing to use everything available in service of its own protection. He invades repeatedly as the hunter moves through the fishing hamlet. 4 times, each invasion positioned at a point where the hunter is making progress toward the hamlet's deepest secret. He is specifically dedicated to this. It is not simply aggression. It is the specific methodical opposition of someone carrying out a directive. His cell is accessible with the key that Simon gave his life to provide. Inside, Breda himself, locked within. Not because he is imprisoned by the church. He has the key to his own cell. He stays in it voluntarily. The specific detail of this, that the church's enforcer has locked himself in the very cell he could unlock, is one of the DLC's most quietly resonant details. He stays because he knows what he has done, the specific weight of the function he has served. Eliminating the people who are getting too close to the truth of what the church had buried is something he has chosen to contain rather than carry into the material world. The cell is a form of self-imposed penance. He is not free of what he has done. He has chosen to remain in proximity to it rather than continue as though it was simply his job. Killing him in his cell rather than in the nightmare invasions stops the invasions. His death in the cell is the most complete form of resolution available to the hunter who finds him there. The lighthouse and what it overlooks. The lighthouse at the Hamlet's edge. A structure that would have served in the material world as a navigation marker. The specific function of lighthouses being to mark dangerous coastlines for ships at sea, to prevent the specific catastrophe of ships running onto rocks in the dark. In the nightmare, it marks a different kind of danger. The path past the lighthouse leads to the beach where Kos's body is. The path that the entire DLC has been moving toward. The specific destination that the nightmare was organized around protecting. From the lighthouse's position, looking back toward the village and forward toward the beach, the geography of the nightmare's fishing hamlet becomes clear as a shape. A place that has been organized around a specific point. Every element, the inhabitants, the barnacles and coral, the ship masts above, Brador's invasions, is organized around the protection or the preservation or the permanent grieving of what is on the beach. Simon had died at the lighthouse lamp, the last of his strength spent reaching the threshold. He had found the original sin. He had not been able to address it. He had given the hunter what he had and died with the specific quality of someone who had done all that was possible in the circumstances available. His bow blade, the weapon that combined a bow and a blade in Bloodborne's specific trick weapon tradition, was his legacy to the hunter, a practical gift and a gesture of passing. You continue what I could not. The beach where Kos's body rested, the fishing hamlet's most important location, the site of the original sin and the site of the DLC's final boss encounter. The environment is immediately distinct from everything that preceded it. The nightmare's visual language, the gothic darkness, the corrupted architecture, the specific quality of a place that has been wrong for a very long time, gives way to something that is almost tranquil in comparison. The sea, the pale light, the quality of an outdoor space in a DLC that had been mostly interior. Kos's body is visible on the shore, not simply an environmental prop, a presence. The body of a dead great one, enormous and strange, are persisting in the nightmare as it has persisted on the material world's shore. Its specific quality, even dead, even physically present as a corpse, rather than as an active entity, it carries the weight of something divine. The parasites that have been emanating from it, that the villagers had incorporated into their lives, that have produced their transformations, are here in the water, in the sand, in the air. The specific sound design of the beach encounter is often described as among the most effective in the DLC. The quality of the sea, the ambient presence of the parasites, the specific atmosphere of a place that is both the scene of a crime and the site of an ongoing mourning. And then, movement in the water, something emerging. The orphan of Kos, the fetus that Kos had been carrying when she died, the child of a great one, born into the world in the nightmare rather than in the material reality, born, in some sense, into the dream of death that the curse had created. It carries the placenta, the specific connection to Kos that its death in the material world could not sever, as both a weapon and a remnant of the attachment that its birth in a nightmare had never fully severed. Its first action when encountered, a scream, the specific cry of a newborn, filtered through whatever the nightmare's logic does to biological sounds, carrying an emotional quality that is immediately recognizable as grief, even in its non-human form. The Orphan is the DLC's final boss, not the most mechanically complex encounter in the game, arguably, but the most emotionally dense. Fighting a child that was born into a nightmare, and that has been alone here since the nightmare began. That is the specific remaining consequence of the crime that the first hunters committed. That is both the victim of the sin and the instrument of its punishment. Its second phase, it manifests the form of Kos herself, or something shaped like her, something that incorporates the Great One's scale while maintaining the Orphan's specific ferocity. The child and the mother simultaneously. The crime and its consequence in a single entity. Its death when it comes. The nightmare breaks. The specific visual language of the nightmare dissolving. The landscape becoming light. The weight of the curse lifting. The Orphan's death allows what the nightmare had been holding to release. The souls of the hunters trapped in the endless hunt are freed. Whatever peace was available to the fishing hamlet's inhabitants becomes available. The doll, in the hunter's dream, notes that Gehrman has started sleeping more peacefully for the first time in a long time. This is the final connection. Gehrman, who had been in the hunter's dream, not in the nightmare, whose specific imprisonment was different from the blood-drunk hunters, had nevertheless been carrying something related to the nightmare's existence. Whether he was the hunter who killed Kos, or the Orphan in the material world, whether his connection to Maria and the events of the fishing hamlet had placed him in proximity to the curse even in the dream, the doll's observation confirms it. The nightmare ending produces peace. Not for everyone, not fully, not in ways that resolve the main game's questions, but specifically for Gehrman. The old man in the wheelchair at the hunter's dream sleeps more peacefully when the Orphan of Kos is dead. Sleep well. 3 more parts remain, and the sin is not yet fully accounted for. The Orphan of Kos is dead. The hunter's nightmare has dissolved, but the old hunter's DLC is not simply the story of the nightmare. It is the story of how the nightmare came to be, which means it is the story of Laurence and the specific choice he made that diverged from Willem's path and produced the institution that produced the sin. We have followed the nightmare's geography through the areas that document the healing church's layered history. The research hall, what the choir did to patients, the fishing hamlet, what the old hunters did to the village and to Kos. Tonight we go further back, to the man at the origin of the church's path, and to the specific moment that his skull in the nightmare commemorates. The split at Bergenwerth College, the institution that predates the healing church, whose scholars had been studying the Thumerians and their labyrinths, whose contact with Great One knowledge had produced the specific body of understanding that Laurence and Willem had both inherited and then divided between them. Master Willem's position, the path toward ascension, toward becoming something that could commune with the Great Ones on their own terms, ran through the mind rather than through the body. Eyes on our palms, he would say. in the specific phrase that had become his school's most recognizable expression. Developing the capacity to perceive, to accumulate insight, to open the specific mental faculties that contact with cosmic truth required, without relying on the biological shortcut that the old blood represented. The old blood was a shortcut, not a false path. It genuinely opened things that the slow development of insight through study could not open as quickly. But shortcuts carry costs that the slower paths do not. The old blood's cost, what it did to the body, to the mind, to the specific relationship between the person who consumed it and the beast nature that the blood scourge expressed. The old blood gave insight and took something in return that no one fully understood until the taking was already advanced. Laurence's position. The old blood could be administered, could be controlled, could be distributed to the population of Yharnam and beyond in a framework that provided its healing benefits, its genuine medicinal power, its real capacity to heal illness and injury that nothing else in the setting could address, while managing the transformation risk through oversight and structure and the specific institutional logic of a church that could monitor its congregation's relationship to the blood they were consuming. He was not naive. He did not believe there was no risk. He believed the risk could be managed, and he believed that the people of Yharnam deserved access to the healing that the old blood provided, even if that access came with a risk that Willem's more careful approach would have denied them. This is one of the law's most interesting ethical positions. Laurence's choice was not simply selfish or corrupt. It was a genuine assessment of the available options. People were sick and dying. The old blood could heal them. In Willem's path would eventually arrive at something perhaps better. But eventually is a long time for someone who is currently sick and dying. He split from Willem. He took his followers. He founded the healing church. He distributed the blood. What his choice produced. The healing church under Laurence was not evil by design. The early period of blood ministration, the specific era in Bloodborne's history that corresponds to the church's genuine mission, rather than its subsequent corruption, produced real healing. People who had been suffering from diseases that the medical knowledge of the era could not address found relief. Communities that had been decimated by illness found stability. The institution grew around this genuine function. The cathedrals, the workshops, the hierarchy of bishops and vicars, and the specific organizational logic of a religious institution that was also a medical institution. These were built to sustain and distribute something that was genuinely helping people. And then the blood required more. The specific trajectory of the healing church's corruption is not a single moment of decision. It is the accumulated logic of an institution that had committed to the old blood and found that commitment pulling it further in one direction than the initial commitment had implied. The old blood's properties required ongoing contact with Great One knowledge to maintain and develop. Great One knowledge required research. Research required subjects, and subjects required, or the institution gradually came to believe they required, the specific violations that the research hall and the fishing hamlet represent. The choir's procedures on the research hall's patients were not Laurence's decision alone. They were the product of the specific institutional logic that the founding choice had set in motion, the gradual expansion of what was permissible in service of what the institution had committed to. Laurence may not have fully anticipated this. His skull in the nightmare, the skull that serves as a reminder of what he failed to protect, suggests a man who understood, in retrospect, that the choice he had made at Bürgenwerth had produced something he had not intended, not because he had been deceived, but because the logic he had set in motion had its own momentum that he could not fully control once it was underway. Laurence in the nightmare. The hunter's nightmare contains, in its version of the Grand Cathedral, the most sacred space of the healing church, replicated in the nightmare with the specific distortion that the curse imposes on familiar architecture, a specific boss encounter that the DLC keeps hidden until the player seeks it out. Laurence the First Vicar, a cleric beast, the specific category of transformation that the main game introduces as its first boss, the form that blood ministration produces in clergy whose exposure to the old blood has reached a specific threshold. The first vicar, the founder of the institution, has become what his institution was supposed to prevent. He is on fire. Specifically, the lower half of his body is constantly burning. The specific connection to fire that runs through Bloodborne's lore as a purifying force, as a way of addressing beasthood, as the thing that the main game's Jura and the burning of old Yharnam had represented. He drags himself across the arena, leaving burning trails, attacking with the ferocity of something that retains enormous power without any of the structure that the power had once served. The encounter is optional. The hunter does not need to fight Laurence to complete the DLC's main story. He is accessible through a specific sequence, bringing his skull from the research hall to the nightmare's version of the Grand Cathedral. That is only discovered through thoroughness rather than through the main quest's guidance. And this is the specific design choice that characterizes the encounter. The man who made the choice is not at the center of the story. He is off to one side, requiring deliberate effort to reach, not the final boss or the guardian of the deepest secret. He is an optional accounting. When defeated, he does not speak. The specific dignity of Ludwig's moment of recognition, the holy moonlight sword illuminating the fragmentary awareness of who he had been, is not present in Laurence's encounter. He fights and he falls without the specific grace of recovered memory. What he drops, the skull of the first vicar. The item description elaborates on what the skull means, what Laurence sought in it, what he failed to protect, the specific shape of a man who understood his failure. What the skull says. The skull of the first vicar carries the item description that completes the encounter's meaning. Laurence had sought his human skull, found in the research hall, brought to the nightmare, because it reminded him of what he had failed to protect, the creed of Bürgenwerth, the specific intellectual and ethical principles that his teacher had built the institution around, the commitment to the slow path, to the development of perception through study rather than through the blood shortcut, the principles that Laurence had abandoned when he split from Willem and founded the Healing Church on the foundation of blood ministration, and his own humanity, the specific personal quality of a man who had made a choice that, at the time, seemed reasonable, seemed, in fact, like the more humane option. and had watched it produce the research hall and the fishing hamlet, and eventually the nightmare. The skull is not a relic of his greatness. It is a reminder of what his greatness had cost. He had been a brilliant man who made a choice that set a cascade in motion that he could not stop and did not survive. The nightmare preserved him in the form that choice had produced, a burning beast in the ruins of the grand institution he had built, seeking the skull that reminded him of who he had been before he built it. The connection to the main game. Laurence's skull appears in the main game as an item that can be found in the Grand Cathedral in the material world of Yharnam. For the connection between the skull's presence there and its role in accessing the nightmare encounter is a design element that rewards players who pay attention to what the game provides. The specific relationship between the Healing Church's architecture in the material world and the Nightmare's version. The Grand Cathedral replicated in both, the skull existing in both, Laurence present as a beast in the Nightmare and absent from the material world's version, is part of how the DLC and the main game talk to each other. Ebrietas is in the main game's Grand Cathedral, or above it, in the Altar of Despair. The daughter of the cosmos, the great one that the choir had contacted through the Iasil labyrinths and brought into the material world, who the Healing Church had been studying and worshipping and attempting to use for transcendence. She is present in the space that corresponds to what the nightmare version of the same space contains. She is presented in the main game as someone to fight, not as someone whose history is deeply engaged with. The DLC fills in what she represents, the continuation of what the fishing hamlet's discoveries and the choir's research had been reaching toward. The Great One brought into the material world, studied rather than simply encountered, used rather than simply encountered. The specific tragedy of Ebrietas is not in the DLC. It is in the gap between the DLC and the main game, in what the Healing Church had become by the time the material world's version of the Grand Cathedral contained her. Sleep well. 2 more parts remain, and the sin runs deeper than the nightmare. The DLC is called The Old Hunters, not The Old Hunter's Nightmare, not the fishing hamlet, not Laurence or Maria or Ludwig. The Old Hunters, plural. The specific generation of people who hunted before the Healing Church had fully institutionalized the hunt, whose specific sins produced the specific curse, whose existence the nightmare was built to contain. Tonight we follow the oldest of the old hunters, the man who was not in the nightmare, whose specific imprisonment was elsewhere, whose connection to the DLC's events is present in every corner of it, without him being directly present in any of them. Gehrman, the first hunter, the man in the wheelchair, the one who at the end of the main game either asks the hunter to be freed or tries to kill them. Before the workshop, Gehrman predates the Healing Church, and this is easy to forget in the main game's presentation of the world. The Church is so dominant, so central to Yharnam's current organization, that it can seem like the organizing principle of everything that came before it as well. But the old workshop, Gehrman's institution, the one that the Healing Church eventually absorbed or superseded or built itself on top of, was there first. He developed the hunter's tools, the specific weapons and the trick weapon concept. blades that transformed between configurations, that adapted to different combat requirements through the specific mechanism of mercury filling and shifting. These were his inventions. The workshop tradition of precise, effective weapons for the specific purpose of fighting beasts is his legacy. He also developed the hunter's philosophy. The main game and the DLC together communicate this through the items associated with him and the NPCs who speak of him. The hunt as a vocation, as something that required not just capability, but a specific relationship to what you were doing and why. The specific connection between a hunter and their weapon, between their weapon and their capability, between their capability and the protection of people who could not protect themselves. This is who Gehrman was before everything that happened after. The fishing hamlet. Whether Gehrman was at the fishing hamlet is one of the most discussed questions in Bloodborne's lore community. The evidence is indirect. He is not confirmed in the way that Maria is confirmed. His presence is suggested rather than established. What the evidence includes. The dolls note that Gehrman sleeps more peacefully after the Orphan of Kos is dead. This note connects him specifically to the orphan, to the child of Kos, in a way that is more specific than simply general connection to the DLC's events. If Gehrman sleeps more peacefully when the orphan dies, the implication is that the orphan's existence had been disturbing his sleep, which implies a specific connection to the orphan, rather than simply connection to the nightmare in general. The most specific reading, Gehrman killed Kos, or killed the orphan in the material world, before the nightmare formed, in the specific act that completed whatever happened at the fishing hamlet. The hunters had violated Kos's body, had harvested from the dead Great One, had taken from the villagers, had done what they had done. The final act, in some readings, was Gehrman killing the child that Kos had been carrying, the orphan, which in the material world had been found and killed as part of the same expedition that had produced everything else. If this is accurate, the orphan's death in the nightmare, which broke the curse and produced the peace that the doll observed in Gehrman, was the completion of something that Gehrman had started in the material world. The child killed in the real world had been killing him in the dream world ever since. Its presence in the nightmare an ongoing accusation. Its death in the nightmare the specific resolution that material world killing had not provided. This is speculative. The lore does not confirm it. It offers enough that the speculation is coherent and leaves enough open that the speculation remains speculation. The workshop's end and the dream's beginning. The old workshop, the building that appears in the main game as an abandoned structure accessible through a secret path from the cathedral ward, had been, at some point before the events of the game, the functional center of Gehrman's hunting tradition, the workshop where the tools were made, where the hunters were trained, where the specific legacy that Gehrman built had its physical home. It was abandoned. The specific reason, when and why and under what circumstances, is not detailed. But the abandoned workshop in the main game carries the presence of what it had been. The tools on the shelves, the dust, the specific atmosphere of a place that had once been full of purpose and is now empty. Maria's presence is here too. The old hunter bone, the item found in the workshop, are associated with an apprentice of Gehrman, connects the workshop to Maria's specific history. She had been trained here. The doll was made here, in the workshop, after Maria's disappearance. The hunter's dream, the nightmare's counterpart. Not a prison for the blood drunk, but a specific place of suspension that the moon presence had created for Gehrman. The research on whether the dream was offered to him or imposed on him, whether Gehrman sought a bargain with the moon presence or was simply taken, is another of the law's maintained ambiguities. What is clear, the moon presence needed a hunter. The specific mechanism of the hunter's dream required someone who knew how to train hunters, who could pass the old knowledge to the dreaming visitors, who could maintain the workshop tradition in the space between waking and dreaming. A Gehrman was the appropriate choice. He was the first hunter. He may have entered the agreement willingly. The grief of losing Maria, of having his most faithful student disappear into the nightmare, of having created the doll as an inadequate replacement, may have made the moon presence's offer of a specific kind of continuation more acceptable than refusing would have been. Not because the dream was genuinely what he wanted, because refusal would have left him with simply the grief, and the dream gave him the workshop and the purpose even in the absence of the person the workshop reminded him of. He wanted to be free. The main game makes this clear. At the encounter's end, Gehrman's wish to be freed is sincere. He has been in the dream for a very long time. The moon presence's hold on him has been the specific imprisonment of someone who had agreed to something and found the agreement's duration longer than they had understood they were committing to. What Maria was to Gehrman. The plain doll's existence is the most direct evidence of what Maria meant to Gehrman. He created something in her image. He prayed to a great one to give it the quality of life that the image alone could not have. The result was not Maria. The doll explicitly acknowledges the difference between herself and the person whose form she shares. But it was the specific result of a man who could not simply put down the connection. The hunters who came to the dream, the player character across multiple playthroughs, and the game's specific lore of multiple hunters visiting the dream rather than a single canonical protagonist, were trained by Gehrman in the workshop. The doll leveled them, spoke to them, maintained the specific warmth of the dream's domesticity. The doll speaks of Gehrman with the specific quality of someone who cares about him without having been designed to care about him. The specific emergent quality of whatever consciousness the Great One's intervention had provided her. She is worried when he is troubled. She notes when he sleeps more peacefully. She is, in some sense, the game leaves ambiguous, genuinely fond of the old man in the wheelchair. This is not what he had wanted when he created her. He had wanted Maria. He had gotten something that cared about him in a way that Maria, who had been his student, in who had respected him, whose feelings for him were not the same as his feelings for her, had not been organized to provide. The irony is quiet and specific, and the game does not press it harder than the environmental storytelling requires. The final hunter. At the very end of the main game, in the sequence that the DLC's events precede, that the nightmare's dissolution is a step toward, the hunter makes a choice. The moon presence demands the hunter submit. The hunter has accumulated enough insight to see through the submission, to reject the cycle, to take the moon presence's umbilical cord, to consume what is needed to fight what needs to be fought. Gehrman fights them, and not from malice, from the specific desperation of someone who has been promised freedom at the dream's end, and who sees the hunter's refusal of submission as the specific action that will prevent the end from arriving. He fights to give the moon presence what the moon presence requires, because his freedom depends on the continuation of the contract. When the hunter defeats him, he is freed. The specific quality of his death in the dream, the petals falling, the old man released, the wheelchair empty, is the specific aesthetic of something being resolved rather than simply ended. The DLC extends this. The nightmare's dissolution, produced by the hunter who carried the eye of a blood-drunk hunter and moved through everything that the nightmare contained, produced specific peace for Gehrman before the main game's final sequence. The Orphan of Kos dead. The old hunters released. The specific weight of what had been accumulating since the fishing Hamlet lightened. He slept more peacefully. For whatever time remained before the main game's ending removed him from the dream entirely, he slept without the specific disturbance that the nightmare's ongoing existence had been producing. It is not a happy ending. It is the specific resolution that the situation allowed, partial, qualified, arrived at through the deaths of many people who did not deserve to die. The peace that Gehrman received was not the peace of having been forgiven or of having fully resolved what his specific contribution to the DLC's events had been. It was simply the peace of a very old, very tired person whose specific nightmare had finally been addressed. Sleep well. One final part remains, and the old hunters have something left to say. Welcome back, my friend. This is the final part. Let everything slow. We have followed the hunter's nightmare from the curse that created it to the crime that caused the curse, from Ludwig's beast form to Maria's vigil, to the orphan on the beach, to Laurence's burning body in the Grand Cathedral. We have followed Gehrman from before the workshop to the dream's quieter nights after the nightmare dissolved. Now we step back, and we ask what the old hunters was doing. What the main game left unanswered. Bloodborne's main game is a story about discovery. The hunter who wakes without memory on a night when the blood scourge has consumed Yharnam, beyond its usual capacity for management, moves through a world that is already in the process of revealing itself. Every area discovered, every NPC spoken to, every item description read adds to the specific picture that the game was always building toward. The truth about the Great Ones, about the blood, about what the healing church had been doing, and what the night of the hunt represented. The main game's revelations are extensive. By the time the hunter reaches the final sequence, they have encountered the moon presence, the Great Ones, the specific theology of the hunt, and the three ending options that the accumulated insight makes available. What the main game does not fully account for, the people who built everything it depicts, the architecture, the Grand Cathedral, the research hall visible in the Forbidden Woods area, the specific aesthetic of the healing church's domain, was built by people whose specific decisions produce the world the hunter moves through, The main game gives you the world without giving you the builders. The old hunters gives you the builders. Ludwig built the church hunters. He had been, before beasthood, the specific person whose vision had organized the hunt into the institution that the main game's world inherited. Laurence had built the healing church on the old blood. Maria had been the finest product of Gehrman's workshop tradition. These were the people whose specific choices, made in specific historical moments, had produced Yharnam. The DLC is Bloodborne's accounting for those choices. Not a judgment, it does not condemn the builders or celebrate them. It shows them in the state their choices had produced. Ludwig as a beast, Laurence as a burning cleric beast, Maria as a guardian in a nightmare. The accounting does not need to editorialize. The images speak. The sin and what it was. The specific sin that the old hunters documents is not simply the fishing Hamlet. The fishing Hamlet is the most concentrated and most explicitly documented atrocity. The massacre of a village, the violation of a dead god's body, the specific crime that Kos's curse responded to. But the DLC's broader argument is that the fishing Hamlet was not an exception. The research hall's patients had been subjected to procedures designed around the same logic that produced the fishing Hamlet. The logic, the end, insight, transcendence, the great one knowledge that the healing church had committed to pursuing, justified the means. The patients were not the ends. They were the means. The villagers of the fishing Hamlet were not the ends. They were the means. This is the original sin that Simon was searching for. Not the specific event, but the specific logic. The decision, made at some level of the institution, by some combination of Laurence and the choir, and the old hunters who served them, that the beings who were being subjected to the experiments and the massacre were less important than what the experiments and the massacre might produce. The healing church had institutionalized this logic, not because the people who built it were simply evil. Laurence's skull suggests a man who understood the failure, who sought the reminder of it, because the logic had been available, had seemed to work, had produced results. And once an institution commits to a logic that produces results, the institution tends to follow the logic further than the individuals inside it would have followed it if asked to decide alone. This is the specific horror that the old hunters is interested in. Not the horror of the monsters or the beasts or the cosmic entities. The horror of ordinary institutional processes producing extraordinary atrocities through the accumulated weight of many individually defensible decisions. The three spaces and their three sins. The DLC's three major areas correspond to three specific sins in the healing church's history, moving backward through time as the hunter moves deeper into the nightmare. The hunter's nightmare and its hunter population, the most recent layer. The blood-drunk hunters. The latest generation of the healing church's hunters, whose blood madness had reached the threshold that drew them into the nightmare. Not the original sin, but the ongoing consequence, the specific result of an institution that had always been drawing its hunters from the same well and losing them to the same outcome. The research hall, the intermediate layer, the choir's experiments on patients, the specific procedures that the fishing Hamlet's discoveries had made the choir believe were possible and worth pursuing. This is closer to the original sin than the blood-drunk hunters. It is a deliberate institutional practice, rather than an accumulation of individual deteriorations. The fishing Hamlet, the oldest layer, the original crime, where it started, where Kos's body was, where the curse was earned. The DLC's progression is backward through institutional time. The hunter who enters the nightmare and reaches the fishing Hamlet has moved from the most recent consequence to the most ancient cause. How the three spaces form a specific kind of historical argument. The present is the product of everything in the past, and the past is accessible if you go deep enough, and what you find at the bottom is what everything was built on. What Maria's choice means. Lady Maria is the DLC's emotional center. Not the most powerful figure, Ludwig and Laurence are arguably more significant in the Healing Church's history. Not the most morally compromised, Brado and the choir's practices represent more deliberate ongoing harm. Maria is the DLC's emotional center because of what she chose to do with what she had done. She could have remained in the endless hunt. The blood-drunk hunters in the nightmare are in the specific condition of not choosing anything. The beasthood has taken the capacity for choice, or the nightmare has, or the combination of the two. They are simply there, doing what the curse produces. Maria retained her sanity. She retained her capacity for choice, and she chose to stay in the clocktower. To look after the patients, the damaged people from the research hall, who were also in the nightmare, who had also been subjects of the institution's logic, to guard the secret, to remain at the site of what had been done, rather than to simply wait for the curse to end, or to find some other accommodation with the nightmare's conditions. Whether her presence in the clock tower was protection or punishment, whether she was keeping the secret because she believed it should be kept, or because she understood that the secret's revelation was the path to the nightmare ending, is one of the law's most resonant ambiguities. Her words to the hunter: a corpse should be left well alone. She fights to keep them from reaching the fishing Hamlet. Whether she is protecting Kos's body from further violation, or protecting the secret the nightmare was created to contain, or simply fulfilling a vigil she had assigned herself. The fight is her final act of staying. When the hunter kills her, she does not survive to see the nightmare end. She does not see the orphan's death or feel the curse lift. Her specific peace, if peace is what she receives, is not documented. She reaches upward before collapsing. Make contact. Whatever she was reaching for in that gesture was what she had been unable to reach throughout the nightmare's duration. And the hunters who cannot be named. There is a specific category of person implied by the old hunters DLC, who does not appear in it directly. The ordinary hunters. The church hunters, who had not gone blood drunk, who had served the institution without becoming its most extreme product, who had lived and died in the service of the Healing Church's stated mission without being drawn into the nightmare. They are present by implication. Every hunter who appears in the main game's world, every NPC, every enemy in hunter attire, every figure who had served the institution, had been operating within the system that the old hunters DLC documents. They had not all gone blood drunk. They had not all participated in the fishing hamlet or the research hall. Most of them had simply been hunters. The old hunters is not arguing that every hunter who served the healing church was guilty of what the institution had done. It is arguing that they had served the institution, that their service had sustained and legitimized a system that produced, at its edges and at its history's most compromised moments, what the nightmare contained. This is the most uncomfortable implication of the DLC's specific argument. Not that the monsters were bad, not that the obvious villains were guilty, but that ordinary institutional participation in a flawed institution carries its own specific relationship to that institution's worst outcomes. The hunters who fought the beasts were also the hunters whose service sustained the church that experimented on patients and massacred fishing villages. They did not all know. The institution's specific logic had been maintaining the secrecy that Simon was trying to breach, the secrecy that Brador had been killing people to maintain. Most ordinary hunters had not known what the choir did in the research hall, or what had happened at the fishing hamlet. Not knowing is not innocence. It is the specific condition of someone who had chosen, or been allowed, not to look. One final image. The beach where Kos's body rests. After the orphan is dead, after the nightmare has dissolved, after everything the hunter has moved through to reach this specific location, the beach is quiet. The body of a dead great one on the shore of a nightmare sea. The village behind it, transformed and still. The ship masts above, enormous, floating in the specific way of things that should not be floating but are, because the nightmare has its own relationship to gravity and reason. The orphan's death did not restore the fishing hamlet. The massacre did not become unmassacred. The experiments did not become unexperimented. The sin did not become unsinned. The nightmare dissolved, which means the curse lifted, which means the hunters who were trapped in it were released. But the village remains as it had been. What was taken from the fishing hamlet was not given back. The specific wrong that the curse was responding to was not corrected. The curse ending was not justice. It was the specific resolution available when the specific mechanism of the curse was addressed. The underlying wrong remained wrong. This is the specific honesty of the old hunter's ending, not the satisfying closure of a story where the right thing was done and the consequences were appropriate. The available resolution in circumstances that didn't offer an appropriate one. Kos, or some say Cosm, the final echo of the DLC's last item, the Kos parasite, worn by hunters who could withstand it, providing power that came from the body of the dead god on the shore. The last thing she had to give, available to those who came to the place where she was and could use what remained of her presence. Not forgiveness, nor resolution, simply what was here, available to what came after. This has been the entire old hunter's timeline. From Kos on the shore and the hunters who violated her, through the healing church's layered history of research hall experiments and blood-drunk hunters, and through Lady Maria's vigil and Ludwig's beast form and Laurence's burning regret, to the beach where the orphan's death broke what Kos's grief had held together. Told slowly, over 8 nights, for the dark between sleep and the things we carry into it, the hunters who could no longer stomach it, the ones who couldn't stop, the ones who made the choice that made everything, all of them, finally, still, good night.